Beautiful way to start. All right, wholeness and health of mind. So this is probably going to be a 2 or 3-part series, actually. Today we'll consider it to be part number 1. Ernest Holmes, the founder of this philosophy, wrote a whole lot in the Science of Mind textbook and others about healing of all types. Mental, emotional, and physical. Matter of fact, in this book right here, in this Science of Mind, in chapters 14 and 15, which are 2 very large, it's like this whole chunk out of the middle is chapter 14 and 15 in here, called physical healing. And he talks about everything from arthritis to constipation to heart trouble to insomnia and to vision and kind of everything in between. And he kind of lays out the mental, emotional changes to be made behind it. So he doesn't say so much about this is what caused it. Louise Hay does a whole lot of work about that. He rather focuses on how to change it. So if you've got this thing going on, what proper thinking is going to change that? What mindset is going to change that? I like that because he puts the focus on what to do about it. Not how it got there, but what to do about it. And I like that. So if you're interested in that, 2 whole chapters in this book are devoted to that, plus other books that he wrote. Back in the day when Ernest Holmes was writing, there was a lot of people who were doing mental healing. It was even more prominent than it is right now because people were really experimenting with the whole idea of let's see if we can heal people by spiritual and mental means. The 2 things are really connected because our mentality is how we know our spirituality. So mental, spiritual to me has become to mean the same thing, and emotional really too. They're not separated. So there's a lot of folks who are doing that kind of healing, including Ernest Holmes. So in this part 1, I'm going to talk a whole lot about the health aspect of our bodies. Okay? The premise of it all, as in everything that we do here, the premise of this idea of healing is that there is only one thing. And that our physical bodies, everything that we see in the physical universe on this planet is a creation of the One. Every single thing is a creation of the One. And so that's premise number 1. If we are all a creation of that one thing, then we have been endowed with its wholeness. Our very bodies are the body of God. If you take the whole planet, just our planet is enough to deal with. Let's forget the rest of the solar system and galaxies beyond galaxies. But just our planet alone, everything that we see and form, Ernest Holmes says, that's the body of God. Showing up here as all of us, as every animal, every tree, every fish, everything is the body of God, the manifest body of God. And we are created in the image and likeness, premise number 1. Okay, and remember, in this philosophy, we're not teaching about a God who's a dude out there who's giving birth to you, but rather the source of all that is showing up right here in our bodies. So our bodies, everything about us is already made whole. It's already made whole. Premise number 1 is so important. So important. But we forget. We totally forget that we are made out of that. We think wrongly. We think negatively so often. We think, ain't it awful? We buy into the commercials that tell us how bad things are for our health and all the meds that we're going to need. We have really bad habits sometimes, really bad unhealthy habits. We experience illness because we believe we're going to, by and large. And so we forget that we were made whole. And so we need to remind ourselves over and over again what's the truth of us to begin with. Ernest Holmes and this whole philosophy puts a whole lot of emphasis on what he calls right thinking. When people say, well, right thinking, what do you mean? As opposed to wrong thinking? Well, I like to think of it this way. Right thinking is going back to premise number 1. Right thinking means get our mind aligned with the truth that this oneness is already what we came from. So right thinking is not as opposed to wrong thinking. Right thinking is align myself with that higher truth, that there is only one thing. So with that emphasis, that's the thing that we say that we put first. Ernest Holmes acknowledges many times the collaborative healing aspect of our spiritual prayers and medical healing. And I think that he did this largely in response to, back in the day, Mary Baker Eddy, who is the founder of Christian Science, took the premise that everything is God and so our bodies are illusions. And so that's why they said, you don't get to go to doctors. Because if everything is an illusion, all you need to do is pray and you're going to get healed. Well, that would be true. As a matter of fact, I'm going to say it differently. That is true. That is absolutely true. But we are also human beings walking this very human physical life, and we don't always get our minds right there every time, do we? We have to go through a process. And so Ernest Holmes says, everything is God, everything is a creation of God, therefore this is also a creation of God. We don't deny the physical body. That was sort of his answer to what was going on in Christian Science at the time. So he said, yeah, of course you can go to a doctor, because whether it's a pill or a prayer, you use what you can use. So he didn't deny people who were following his way. He didn't deny them anything. And I add, whatever you're going to do it with a deep sense of faith that it's going to work. So if you've got something serious going on, let's say you've been told you've got cancer, you're going to choose to do chemotherapy. You might as well go into it with the full faith and belief that that chemotherapy is going to work. If you go into it with any other mindset, you can kind of figure where it's going. If you're going to do your prayer work and say, I'm not going to do the medical route, I'm going to just do my prayers and I'm going to change my eating habits, same thing. You might as well believe that what you're going to do is going to work. Go into it with the consciousness of faith, that whichever you're going to do. There was Bernie Siegel, there was a man who wrote many books based on much research with cancer patients. Anybody ever heard of Bernie Siegel? Good, then you'll recognize some of this. He started working with people before their treatment. So between here's your diagnosis and then here's what the treatment options we have for you, he would sit down with people and ask them to draw it. Draw it. He'd say, draw or color. He'd put crayons in front of them or markers, all different kinds of colors. And he'd say, draw for me what your treatment looks like. Kids and adults. And by almost a person, depending on how they drew it, told him their mindset. And that told him a whole lot about helping them make that choice. So for instance, one person drew with a black crayon only. Everything was in black. Everything was stick figure. So stick figures are kind of hard line, right? A person sitting on a chair with a hypodermic needle going into their arm and a skeleton with crossbones right next to it. Indicating that that person felt that the chemotherapy was poison. Whether it is or not, we just say it's the mindset, right? So I don't know what, he didn't go on to say how he advised people, but my guess is he said if that's the way you're seeing it, either you need to change your mind or don't do it. Because if you're imagining this is poisonous for me, chances are you're not going to be very successful. On the other hand, people who drew some sort of colorful, life-affirming thing, their pictures they were getting the same chemotherapy, but their pictures showed life and flowers and colors and newness. Those people believed that it was going to work. So that's what we're talking about there. If you're going to do whatever it is, if you're going to take a certain medicine, you might as well believe with every ounce of your belief that it's going to work. Because that's the premise that we're talking about here. So approach it with faith. Now, let me give you a couple of Ernest Holmes' things that he says about it. And I'm going to approach this more from the idea of the mentality comes first and the physical comes second. He says man's life, human life, in reality is spiritual and mental. And until his thought is healed, no form of cure will be permanent. Don't let this be doomsday. Listen again. Man's life, your life, in reality is spiritual and mental. And until your thought is healed, no form of cure will be permanent. So we've all heard stories about somebody goes through some elaborate physical, medical procedure, and they may have a little bit of remission of something, and then they end up right back in the same problem. Because nothing changed mentally or emotionally. Nothing moved in the mind. At the root of all healing is the idea that we are already whole and perfect and complete. So we want to use that understanding